Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In the closing months of winter in 1781 on the Gulf Coast of West Florida, Spanish forces landed under the cover of night, beginning a military campaign that would alter the trajectory of the American Revolution and redraw the map of North America. What unfolded over the next 2 months was a battle for local control and a strategic confrontation that would reverberate far beyond the shores of Pensacola, Florida. By the time the British were forced to surrender in May of 1781, the outcome had stripped Britain of its last foothold on the Gulf of Mexico, cutting off crucial supply routes and shattering its claims to the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Spain's actions on this front directly reinforced the American cause, opening the door for westward expansion and ensuring that when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Britain's negotiating position was weakened beyond repair. The effects of this conflict are felt to this very day. The land in question now forms the heart of states like Alabama and Mississippi, and its control allowed the fledgling United States to expand beyond its original boundaries. Spanish victories along the Gulf Coast bolstered American independence, but they also secured Spain's influence in the region, shaping early trade routes, colonial borders, and the balance of power in the New World. Without these victories, the United States might never have achieved its territorial ambitions, and the geopolitical order of the Americas would look very different. Let's now experience the Siege of Pensacola.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 7, The Siege of Pensacola, the 10th of March to the 9th of May, 1781, in the modern state of Florida. Spanish forces, 3,800 mixed nationality troops. British forces, 1,000 mixed nationality troops. Spain's resounding victory at Pensacola delivered them West Florida, and with it, a decisive blow to British ambitions in the Americas. Coupled with their relentless campaigns across the Mississippi Valley and along the Gulf Coast, the Spaniards dismantled Britain's claim to the sprawling frontier between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, leaving British forces isolated and their colonial aspirations in tatters. This triumph not only redrew the map, but ensured that Spain's influence would loom large over the peace negotiations to come.
The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763 to conclude the ferocious 7 Years' War, upended the balance of power in North America, reshaping the ambitions of empires in one decisive stroke. France's grip on the continent was torn away, leaving it with nothing but the cold solace of fishing rights off Canada's icy shores and a scattering of Caribbean islands to soften the blow. Bereft of its former glory, France relinquished the vast, untamed wilderness stretching between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, known as Louisiana, ceding it to its ally Spain in a concession drenched in defeat. Spain seized Louisiana with eager hands, for she had been forced to surrender Florida to Britain and now sought solace in the invaluable control of New Orleans, the lifeblood of the Mississippi River's trade. Yet the sting of defeat burned in the hearts of both France and Spain, who quietly stewed and waited for the moment when the scales could be tipped back in their favor. Their chance came in 1775, as Britain's 13 American colonies erupted into open rebellion, igniting a fire that neither France nor Spain could ignore. Both Spain and France wasted no time in slipping arms and gold into rebel hands, but their aid remained shadowed in secrecy until the American triumph at Saratoga in October of 1777, which shattered British confidence. The resounding victory at Saratoga left Paris awestruck, prompting the French government to formally recognize the American cause and seal a pact of mutual defense in February of 1778. Spain, however, held back, wary of encouraging a revolution that might spread rebellion to its own colonies. When Britain dismissed Spain's attempts at mediation with contempt, Madrid cast off its hesitation, allied itself with France, though not with the Americans, and entered the war in May of 1779. Spain's ambitions were clear: reclaim the lost lands of Florida and wrest Gibraltar, a fortress of British power for decades, from their grip. Though Spain now openly backed the American cause, its most decisive contribution came through the bold, self-driven actions of Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Louisiana, who operated with fierce independence. With a 1,472-man force drawn from Spaniards, Cubans, Haitians, Santo Domingans, Venezuelans, and Puerto Ricans, Galvez surged up the Mississippi River in the autumn of 1779. Delayed by a hurricane but undeterred, he stormed British forts at Natchez, Baton Rouge, and Manchac, seizing each in rapid succession. In a stroke of brilliance, Galvez secured control of the lower Mississippi, taking 600 British prisoners at the cost of a single life and only 2 wounded. By the spring of 1780, Galvez had pressed his campaign as far north as Lake Michigan, securing the entire Mississippi River for Spain. His forces funneled weapons and supplies to George Rogers Clark, whose victory at Vincennes shattered British control of the Ohio River Valley and left the American West virtually devoid of British troops. The British presence in the region was now reduced to 2 strongholds on the Gulf Coast, Mobile and Pensacola, both clinging precariously to the empire's dwindling grasp. In March of 1780, Galvez reinforced his ranks with troops from Cuba, assembling an assault force of 1,400 men determined to seize Mobile. The initial expedition was battered by fierce storms, forcing a retreat, but on the 13th of March, Galvez returned with a 13-ship convoy, landing his force with unshakable resolve. Over the next 3 days, Galvez entrenched his forces and unleashed a ferocious artillery barrage. His firepower proved so overwhelming that by the end of the first day's bombardment, the British commander at Fort Charlotte signaled his surrender. On the 17th of March, the Spanish flag rose triumphantly over Fort Charlotte, replacing the Union Jack in a stark declaration of victory. Recognizing his brilliance on the battlefield, the Spanish crown promoted Galvez to field marshal. He was just 33, yet already a master of warfare. Yet in Havana, Spanish authorities hesitated, slow to acknowledge Galvez's triumphs or provide the resources he urgently needed for his campaign. Frustrated but undeterred, Galvez sailed to Havana himself, pressing government officials to supply the ships and manpower he needed for his next target, Pensacola, the capital of British West Florida. At last, he assembled a formidable fleet of 64 ships, carrying nearly 4,000 men, and departed Havana on the 16th of October. Nature, however, had other plans. A hurricane tore through the fleet, sinking several ships and forcing Galvez to return to port. Months of painstaking reorganization followed, and by February of 1781, Galvez set sail once more, this time with only 1,315 men aboard a reduced fleet of 20 ships. Determined to press forward, he ordered his forces in New Orleans and Mobile to converge on Pensacola for the decisive assault. Meanwhile, British General John Campbell launched an ill-fated attack on Mobile, only to see his forces falter. Defeated, he withdrew to Pensacola, unaware of the storm that Galvez was about to unleash. On the night of the 9th of March, 1781, Galvez personally led his men ashore at Santa Rosa Island. The landing was flawless. No resistance met them as they swiftly secured Punta de Sigüenza at the island's western edge. The operation was so precise that the British remained oblivious until morning, when a small group of their men stumbled ashore and were promptly taken prisoner. Anticipating the unpredictability of the Gulf, Galvez wasted no time reinforcing the beachhead with men and supplies. The seas held steady, but his prudence left nothing to chance. On the 11th of March, the flagship San Ramon made a bold attempt to enter the harbor, but ran aground on an unyielding sandbar, its advance temporarily halted. The fleet commander, cautious to the point of paralysis, refused further attempts to breach the harbor. Wary of British cannons perched menacingly on the red cliffs with the sandbar well within range. Galvez, though unwilling to tolerate hesitation, boarded his personal frigate, the Galveztown, and sailed it defiantly across the sandbar, daring British guns to fire. His boldness left the fleet commander humiliated, forcing him to allow the remaining ships to enter the harbor, though the commander slunk back to Havana in disgrace. With Spanish guns firmly positioned at Punta de Sigüenza, Galvez paused, his mind already turning over the next decisive step in the campaign. In an act both strategic and humane, Galvez reached out to the British commander, General John Campbell, proposing that the town of Pensacola itself be spared from hostilities to protect its civilian population. Though a handful of skirmishes breached the spirit of the truce, the people of Pensacola were largely left untouched amidst the storm of war surrounding them. When reinforcements approached from the west near the Royal Navy redoubt at Red Cliffs, Galvez led 500 of his men across to the mainland to link up with the advancing force. Shortly after, fresh ships from New Orleans and Mobile delivered additional troops, swelling Galvez's army to over 3,500 men, an imposing force primed for action. The British guns at Red Cliffs thundered ceaselessly, pouring powder and shot into the harbor in a desperate attempt to sink Spanish vessels, but their volleys accomplished little beyond noise and smoke. In the end, the Red Cliffs proved irrelevant, as Galvez resolved to bypass the position entirely with his advancing land forces. On the 24th of March, Galvez shifted the majority of his Santa Rosa garrison to the eastern bank of Sutton's Lagoon, where he established a forward camp, setting the stage for a direct assault on the 3 British forts looming over Pensacola. As the land-based troops maneuvered around Moore's Lagoon to unite with the main force, they endured constant harassment from native warriors allied with the British, their movements shadowed at every turn. The British stronghold loomed on the high ground north of Pensacola, a trio of defenses meticulously arranged for dominance. Fort George anchored the position, supported by the Prince of Wales redoubt at its center and the Queen's redoubt further north, each rising in elevation like a step toward the heavens. General John Campbell commanded a force of roughly 1,800 to 1,900 troops, a mix of British regulars, hardened German mercenaries, American loyalists, and local civilians. Bolstering this motley army were 400 to 500 native allies, fierce fighters whose presence would prove a constant menace to Spanish movements. It was these native warriors who struck hardest, inflicting the majority of Spanish casualties during the tense skirmishes leading up to the establishment of Galvez's second camp. Fort George stood at the heart of the British defense, a sprawling fortress spanning 750 by 1,000 feet. Its earthen ramparts were reinforced by 4 solid blockhouses, with twin palisades encircling a dry moat that dared any attacker to approach. The Prince of Wales redoubt bristled with 8 to 10 cannon, while the Queen's redoubt, though manned by only 50 soldiers, added 4 more cannon to the British arsenal. On the 24th of March, the Spaniards set up a temporary camp west of Sutton's Lagoon. The position, however, proved too distant from the enemy, and was hemmed in by the lagoon itself, making any forward movement a challenge. By the 30th of March, Galvez moved his troops and supplies to the east bank, establishing his main camp. The site was rapidly fortified, a necessity as native attacks erupted almost as soon as the Spaniards began digging in. Reconnaissance revealed the ideal vantage point for an artillery assault, a low hill 2 miles west of the Queen's redoubt, where the high ground would bring Spanish guns within deadly range of the British. Galvez ordered his forces to establish a new encampment at the northern tip of Sutton's Lagoon. From there, they began digging a trench, a painstaking effort to move men and artillery to the heights under cover and out of enemy fire. The second camp came under swift attack by a combined Anglo-Indian force, throwing the Spaniards into a fierce fight for their very survival. But the roar of Spanish artillery soon silenced the assault, driving the attackers back in disarray. A tactician, Galvez ordered a full clearing of the land for 1,000 yards around the camp, denying the native warriors any concealment from which to launch ambushes. He reinforced his position further by bringing native allies from the Mobile region, turning the British-aligned warriors' own tactics against them. On the 19th of April, the horizon filled with sails as a Franco-Spanish fleet arrived from Havana, delivering fresh reinforcements and swelling Galvez's army to a formidable 7,500 men. Throughout late April, the Spanish stronghold took form, though progress was slowed by relentless Anglo-Indian attacks and the punishing fire of British guns from the Queen's Redoubt. Undeterred by Spanish attacks, the British doubled down, fortifying their advanced positions with grim determination, preparing for the storm that they knew was coming. By the 2nd of May, the Spanish had carved a 2,000-foot trench across the high ground's crest, its flanks anchored by 3 redoubts that bristled with their weapons of war. At the heart of the line stood a powerful battery armed with 6 24-pounder cannons and 4 heavy mortars. The northern redoubt added 2 8-pounders and 2 4-pounders, while the southern flank was fortified with an additional pair of 4-pounder guns. An intense artillery duel erupted between the Spanish lines and the Queen's Redoubt, the air filled with fire and iron as both sides struck telling blows, each seeking to gain the upper hand. On the 2nd of May, Galvez ordered a new trench dug eastward from the northern flank. The plan was clear: move closer, position a battery within striking distance, and tighten the noose around the Queen's Redoubt. But at midday on the 4th of May, as Spanish soldiers paused for a rare moment of rest, a surprise attack shattered the calm, catching them in the midst of their meal. An Anglo-German raiding force struck swiftly, spiking several Spanish cannons before vanishing back into the woods, their casualties amounting to just 1 dead and 1 wounded. Unshaken, though, the Spaniards resumed their labor, and by the 7th of March, Galvez resolved that the time had come to strike the Queen's Redoubt head-on from their newly strengthened position. By the 8th of May, Galvez's men had taken their positions, their artillery roaring to life, hammering the Queen's Redoubt in a calculated and relentless bombardment. Then, just before 9 a.m., a Spanish shell screamed through the air and slammed into the British magazine at the Queen's Redoubt. The explosion ripped through the fort with devastating force, killing or wounding nearly 100 men in a single instant. Sensing their moment, the Spaniards surged forward, storming the smoldering redoubt and seizing it. The Queen's Redoubt commanded the highest ground in the region, and from its heights the remaining British positions lay exposed. General Campbell could see the inevitable. His defense was broken. By the afternoon of the 10th of May, 1781, the Union Jack was lowered for the final time, and the British garrison formally surrendered, their defeat absolute. Reports of casualties vary, but the Spanish losses amounted to fewer than 100 killed and around 200 wounded, a small price for such a sweeping victory. The British losses were greater, over 200 killed or wounded, with more than 1,100 taken prisoner, their resistance now ground to dust. The spoils of war were staggering. The Spaniards captured 4 mortars, 143 cannon, 6 howitzers, and 40 swivel guns, along with countless muskets and a massive stockpile of powder and explosives. Despite their defeat, the British were granted full military honors before being evacuated through Havana to New York, their pride bruised, but their dignity intact. For his masterful campaign, Galvez earned the favor of King Carlos III, who bestowed upon him the title Count de Galvez, who was promoted once more and named governor of West Florida, adding to his rule over Louisiana. Not content to rest, Galvez turned his attention to British shipping lanes in the Bahamas, launching operations there while laying plans for a grand invasion of Jamaica, plans interrupted only by the war's end. With the fall of Pensacola, the British forfeited their last hold on the Gulf Coast. Campbell surrendered all of West Florida to Galvez, whose domain now stretched from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, south of the Ohio River. The sweeping victory would prove crucial to American interests when, in 1782, representatives from Britain, France, Spain, and the United States gathered in Paris to negotiate the terms of peace. The British entered the negotiations hoping to confine the United States to a narrow strip of land between the Appalachians and the Atlantic. Yet with the loss of the territory west of the mountains, they held no power to block America's march into the frontier. Spain, too, harbored dreams of claiming the land for itself, but the sheer scale of the territory outstripped its manpower and administrative capacity. Ultimately, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 handed much of the territory to the United States, though the lands that now make up Alabama and Mississippi would not fully pass to American control until the Jay Treaty of 1795. While Spain's covert aid to the American revolutionaries played a role in securing its independence, it was Galvez's relentless campaign along the Mississippi and Gulf Coast that carved open the path for America's westward expansion.